Both Anne and Amy are professors. Both have done their degree work around Buddhism, and their research is around areas of Buddhism. Anne is an ethnographer who's worked on American Buddhism, and especially looking at issues of racial justice, gender, and sexual justice. And Amy comes at it from a different angle. Her work has been in around issues of the body in Buddhism, looking through a monastic lens. And you've both taken the challenge of looking directly at abuse in Buddhist communities in North America. And I wonder if you could just give me a sense of what it is that you've discovered. What does this phenomenon look like?
There's been allegations of abuse, instances of abuse since the 70s or 80s in North America. I mean, not just North America, obviously, but we're primarily looking at North America. And it's been really in every lineage, every tradition, including insight forms of Buddhism, Zen communities, Tibetan Buddhist communities. And those are the three, major lineages in North America. Most of the cases have involved male teachers and female students, sort of the vast majority of them. But there's been some cases of male teachers abusing male students. And, we've heard of very few incidences of female teachers being involved in abuse. And so that's kind of the sweep, and that's what we're really looking at. I just want to kind of mark that we haven't and we don't study abuse in monastic settings in Asia for a number of reasons that we could share, but anecdotally, we know that it does happen, and there are a few other people who have done some work on this, including Sona Mongmo, who is a nun from Bhutan. And we also know a scholar from Sri Lanka. He's studying in England right now, who's working on abuse of children, unfortunately, in Sri Lankan monasteries. So we've kind of met with scholars who worked on that, but we ourselves are not working on that.
Yeah, I'll just echo to Amy that it's clear that abuse is a structural issue, and that we can't, just dismiss it as, one or two bad apple teachers. It's involved, really high ranking teachers across lineages. So I think I just add, that we really need to look at abuse as a structural issue, and not just dismiss it to the odd, individual perpetrator.
One of the things that you're contributing to the study that doesn't really appear very often is to have a survivor-centered approach, where we're not worrying just about what the impact is and what it means for the teacher, but really, how do we put the needs of the survivor at the center? Could you tell me a little bit about that approach?
Yeah, the core of a survivor-centered approach is believing survivors. So that's number one. Starting from a place of trust and belief in the stories that they are telling and the ways that they're relating their experiences. And then it's basically an approach which prioritizes what the survivor knows and what the survivor needs and what the survivor wants. And so, this usually then kind of results in a justice process, which involves both transparency, being explicit about what happened, not keeping secrets, not hiding the narrative, making it available to whom it needs to be made available. And that could be, the community, that could be more widely available. And then putting in place some kind of process where there will be accountability, where the harm that's been done there'll be some justice brought, whether that takes the form of an apology, whether that takes the form of supporting the survivor in some way, or whether that takes the form of, changes that need to be made in the community. But it's starting from the experiences and the perspectives of the survivor, rather than, the contrast case would be starting from the needs and the priorities of the institution or the teacher.
Yeah, I think it was really striking to both of us as researchers, actually, how little coverage survivors had had. Buddhist magazines, had done forums on abuse. But there was really a striking lacuna of, survivor narratives. Like, what was the experience of survivors? How did it impact their relationship to Buddhism? Were they able to stay in Buddhism? Did they experience kind of, cause a rupture from, their whole Buddhist identity? And really, there's only one major piece, which was written by Willa Baker Blythe, called Breaking the Silence on Sexual Misconduct. That was published just a few years ago in Lion's Roar. And she shares her experience as a survivor of sexual misconduct and abuse from Lama Nola, a Tibetan teacher. And that in itself really tells us something, right? That we know that abuse has been happening since the 1980s in these convert communities. So, it's now 40 years of different, waves of reporting on abuse, but there's only one story from the perspective of the survivor. So I think that really, alerts us to, that Buddhist communities, the wider Buddhist kind of worlds aren't really paying attention to, what abuse does to the victims of abuse and the survivors of abuse. So in our project, we're trying to, tilt the balance back to hearing, hearing survivors' accounts and voices.
I think taking a survivor-centered approach really does go against the grain of institutions in, Buddhist institutions, because it involves a kind of misalignment with power. Typically, the survivors are not people who are in positions of power, or and certainly once they come out as survivors, whatever kind of position they had typically is at risk. And so it's kind of deliberately working against the ways that power is structured in communities to take a survivor-centered approach. And it also really tests the adequacy of the ethical structures in the community, right? So if you have a survivor speaking out about their abuse, that immediately makes it difficult for everyone in the community, because they're faced with a situation where this has happened, and what is their response going to be? And that's incredibly uncomfortable for people. It raises a lot of problematic issues and work that needs to be done. And so taking a survivor-centered approach is actually, it's very challenging for institutions. We also think that it's really what you have to do, because the survivors are the people who are they're the experts. They're the ones who understand what abuse really means and what it does and how it happens.
So in your research, as you've come across different communities facing allegations of abuse, can you describe some of the phenomena that you've seen? How do communities, how have they tended to respond to it? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, this is, unfortunately, it's mostly been very inadequate, the response. I'd say inadequate to actually also causing further harm. I think, one of the things that's really stayed with me in this study is, we've heard again and again that the response of the Buddhist community to the survivor, victim survivor sharing their story has been as harmful, if not more harmful, than the actual experience of abuse and, or misconduct. So again, that should really alert us to there's a real issue, that there's a real limitation here. There's something Buddhist communities really need to work on, because in their response, they're causing further harm. And so I think just, a range of responses, we've seen things like denial, a kind of attack of the victim, a minimization of the victim's experience, gaslighting of the victim. What else, Amy? Deflection.
using language, rhetoric, using persuasion, manipulation to convince a survivor that what they experience is not really what they experience, that it actually wasn't abusive the way the survivor initially thought, that in fact, it was meant in some other way, or it's a teaching, or it's a wisdom teaching, or it's actually a great display of the teacher's compassion and love for this. There's a lot of different ways to do it. A lot of them are actually using Buddhist doctrine, shockingly, but to kind of undermine the survivor's own interpretation of the experience. Does that seem fair, Anne?
Yeah, it is about undermining someone else's sense of reality. And I actually just want to add how harmful and cruel it is to engage in gaslighting, because what we found when we've interviewed survivor victims is survivor victims typically go through a really long period to try and make sense of their experience. I would say essentially that they know something wrong has happened, but it's hard for them to really accept that something wrong has happened, because often they typically hold the teacher on a pedestal. So I think it's a long process of them coming to name their own experience, to kind of name the harm that was done to them. And as they describe the process, which can actually sometimes can take years, it's really difficult, and they have a lot of self-doubt. They often blame themselves. They did something wrong. It must have been, if something wrong happened, it must have been because they did something wrong. So it's quite painful to watch, another human go through this process of kind of self-doubt when they've, clearly been harmed. And so, they come into their truth, and then they speak their truth. And then if they receive, the response of gaslighting, it kind of, the community tries to push them back into that place of self-doubt. So again, it's a kind of reoccurrence of harm. And I found that really difficult to hear, to see someone struggling that way.
I think another term that sometimes people bring into responses to abuse is spiritual bypassing, which is, it's almost like a version of gaslighting, but it's the idea of, reframing the abuse as something that is of spiritual benefit. And that is something that we've seen many times, so, a really kind of basic example would be in the Shambhala community around some of the experiences that people had with Chogyam Trungpa. The term crazy wisdom was used to describe those. And so that's a way of kind of elevating something that may have felt very intrusive, very abusive, non-consensual, to this kind of higher plane of ethics, sort of transcending conventional ethics and going to a higher plane and kind of reinterpreting the experience in that way. And that's incredibly confusing, to make your way out of, especially if you have commitments to the doctrines and the worldview of that community. It's incredibly difficult to hang on to, your own interpretation when you're being kind of confronted with that sort of interpretation from, a group that you're very committed to.
Yeah, very psychologically and emotionally destabilizing. So it's really like a continuation of the abuse. I think in a way it's like the abuse happens, between the teacher and the student, but it's not contained to the experience between the teacher and the student. The abuse kind of is extended when a community responds badly, doesn't respond appropriately. And so, yeah, I think that's really something, again, the response is so important. The right response can reduce suffering and, lead to healing. The wrong response, which unfortunately is a much more common one, is, kind of reproduces and extends harm, kind of continues the abuse in different forms, you might say.
What would a right response look like?
Well, we've been really helped a lot by a lawyer called Carol Macheza. Carol's been an incredible resource to many, to many survivors and also to survivor advocates. And what she really emphasizes is the first of all, the importance of when an allegation is made, it must be taken seriously. It must be taken, as this is grounds for an investigation. And so an investigation, would follow, a certain procedure. Ideally the procedures would be set up in advance in the community. So there would be like an ethical and grievance process, which would be followed in the, in the extent of someone making an allegation, in the event, of someone making an allegation. But essentially what Carol says is it's also, ideally you want to bring in a third party to do the investigation. And that third party, for example, Faith Trust is one Buddhist organization that Carol's worked with and recommends. And they would come into the community and do, interviews with all, the appropriate parties, and they conduct a, independent investigation. And then on the basis of, their findings, they will, make recommendations for actions. So, for example, an apology, of that would be ideal, a recognition of harm by the teacher, accountability by the teacher, a recognition of the harm that the teacher's caused, and then whatever processes of, reparation were agreed upon. And she always stresses, in fact, that an investigation, protects everyone in the community. It works for the person making the allegation and also works for the person who is being accused, because obviously, it's very rare, but false accusations do happen, incredibly rare, but they do happen. And so an investigation, if the allegation is false, protects the teacher and the community as well. But what typically happens is, that an investigation, is the investigations that have happened that we know of actually have nearly all been caused by external pressure. So outside parties from the community who have put pressure on the community, which is very disappointing that communities aren't themselves capable of responding. Sorry, Amy, I rambled a bit there.
Not at all. No, I think that's a really excellent response for communities. I was just going to add some shades of gray, which I've also heard Carol talk about. We love Carol. We really rely on her. Which is so there are situations that could arise where perhaps it's not a teacher and a student, or there isn't a really dramatic or egregious power differential, right? Perhaps it's two, people in the community on the same level. There's various situations, right, which could be abusive, and where there could be allegations, where there could be a problem that needs to be dealt with in the community. So one of the things that I've also heard Carol say is that you don't need to bring in an investigative, outside investigative team in every single situation. So there are situations which are, perhaps, as I said, between two people who are on the same level, where the teacher is not involved. So the problem with, not having an outside investigator when the teacher is someone who's very prominent, has a power position, is involved, is oftentimes, they're kind of influencing the response, right? Because they're powerful in the community. So you definitely need someone outside to investigate in that case. But say it's someone who's not in a position like that, right? Who's been accused of abuse. In those cases, like you need to fall back on having a really solid ethics policy, a very explicit and solid ethics policy that has been agreed on, and that the community has arrived at in a collaborative community-based process. And then a very clear grievance procedure for putting those ethics into play, into action when something happens.
Yeah.
So that's another piece of it that's really important.
Yeah, because I just want to add, to the situation when the community's ethics and grievance policy, suffice. It's really important to have it in before a crisis.
Yes.
Because when the crisis has happened, that's absolutely the worst time to try and construct an ethics and grievance policy, because everyone is highly charged, highly emotional. So again, preventative measures will really help. And the other thing that's really important that Carol always emphasizes is it's very important that no retaliation is made towards a community member making the allegation, you know, the victim, potential victim or assumed victim. It's really important that they do not, you know, face shunning, which happens. We've seen a lot of examples of victims being shunned when they've made, you know, when they've made allegations, shamed, silenced. So it's really important that community members kind of, you know, Carol always says, you know, just kind of, you know, don't jump to any conclusion, you know, try and just have faith that the investigation, you know, will be done properly, or the grievance process will be done. And then, you know, the truth will be discovered at the end of it.
And typically, I think part of the grievance procedure is confidentiality for, you know, for a good portion of that process, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is also important for people who are in a position of bringing allegations, that their privacy be protected, you know, as much as they wish it to.
Many of the certainly Tibetan Buddhist communities, but also other communities in other forms of Buddhism, are very much sort of focused on and centered around the teacher. The boards are, for the most part, going to be loyal to that teacher. And in many cases, the organization will face serious difficulties if the teacher is discredited or dislodged from their position, which makes it very difficult to get to the point where an investigation is taking place. And, you know, we all met around, you know, my involvement in trying to get the FPMT to investigate a set of allegations. And I think we've, you know, what you've said is certainly holds true, that the organization itself is not going to be inclined either to investigate or act on in ways that echo what you're describing as ideal. So, you know, how does the institutional or hierarchical structures that are sort of teacher-based, we can see how that makes abuse possible, because there are teachers who are not accountable that much to anyone. How does that make it difficult to move towards transparency and accountability?
I mean, I think it makes it super difficult. You've got two big obstacles. One is that you've got the default loyalty to the teacher, and then you've got the kind of culture of an institution and an organization. The culture is self-preservation of the institution. So you've got a kind of, you know, they're the two obstacles you face with. And in our two case studies in our book, one is the FPMT and one is against the stream. You know, it's quite telling that in both cases, the organization only acted when they were confronted by outside pressure, and also by the threat of exposure, public exposure. Like, if you don't deal with this situation, we will make it public, you know, we'll make it public in the Buddhist press. And then also Carol always says, you know, that when she started working on Buddhist communities, she was quite hopeful. She thought, oh, you know, the Buddhists, or she was, you know, previously a workplace, she was an investigator of sexual violence in the workplace. So she kind of expected that Buddhist organizations would be better. And she said that it was a big disillusionment process for her, that she found that Buddhist organizations had done worse than corporate America, which I think is a real, you know, reality check for all. I you know, practice Buddhism myself. So what she says now is actually it's a threat of legal action. It's a threat of being sued that often will move an organization forward, because a board of directors actually has has ethical obligations that if they don't fulfill, that they are actually vulnerable to being sued. And that I think a lot of Buddhists, you imagine that the Buddhist, you hope that the Buddhist world's a bit more transcendent and does better than the mundane world. But actually, we're really interested in just the facts of what's happened in these cases. And actually, it has been outside pressure, i.e. other Buddhists, often, peers or other Buddhist leaders who have put pressure on. Zen teachers wrote public letters, for example, around 2010, in the case of some Zen repeat offenders. There was 2 or 3 public letters that 95 Zen teachers, signed, or there's this threat of legal action. And again, that's kind of a bit sobering, isn't it? I think, that Buddhist organizations kind of need that push. So I think getting clear on legal obligations is really important. What are your legal obligations as a Buddhist organization? And then also developing networks of Buddhist accountability. So, where other Buddhist organizations, might try and intervene and step up to some degree and say, no, this is not acceptable, Amy, what do you think? Does that sound right to you, more or less?
Yeah, for sure. And definitely. And then I was going to also just add that there are a couple models as well of communities that are very intentionally kind of restructuring themselves. So these are communities. So one thinking of the Zen Center of Los Angeles, and then I'm also thinking of Lama Willa Baker's Natural Dharma community. And those are both examples of communities that are in lineages that tend to be kind of, have a kind of guru model, right? Elevate the teacher very strongly. And in both cases, those communities have very intentionally attempted to restructure the way that they do things so that it's more on we could say a mandala. That's the Lama Willa uses that kind of image of a kind of mandala structure where there's circles rather than a hierarchy, a pyramid structure, and that there's a lot of kind of collaborative decision-making in the community and also accountability that's coming, from sort of all sides. And, it's a very different model of what a Buddhist community looks like. And I think in a way you could say these are both experimental communities. There isn't sort of 2,500 years worth of history, sort of proving that they are functioning in a great way. But I think in both cases, they're really, really interesting experiments. And I think they could be, they could give other communities something to model off of if they'd like to, do something that is flattening the hierarchy a bit, I would say. And I guess the other thing that I just wanted to add is that, the way I think about it, I think we also need to kind of reconcile to making some kind of broader culture shifts, right, around sexual ethics. And that requires some work. And so, I'm actually thinking of Pema Chondro and her community, and she's doing a lot of work around, I know, Damcho, that you work with her. She's doing a lot of work around sexual education, talking about consent, talking about, what abuse actually is, and doing it within her community in the Buddhist context. And I think that kind of thing is also really, really important for communities that, we need to be more fluent, right, in sexual ethics. And we can draw on, in fact, probably have to draw on non-Buddhist sources oftentimes to get a better handle on that. And there's a huge literature on consent, really helpful literature on consent that could be brought in. And Pema Chondro is a really good example of someone who's doing that.
So you've been talking about initiatives that the leadership of Buddhist organizations could take or teachers could take And I'd like to think a little bit about what ordinary community members can do to contribute to a shift around this issue. Maybe let's think about what happens to a community when there are abuses and they're not investigated, or the person who's accused of having abused a student doesn't respond at all. Can you talk about what that silence does both to a community and to survivors?
I mean, it's incredibly corrosive, I think, from a number of different, on a number of different levels. I mean, so I'll start with the survivor. I mean, it obviously, we've already kind of talked a bit about gaslighting and about the ways in which survivors are silenced, right? And how it's already an incredibly confusing experience to begin with and harmful, and then it's a reharming. So the lack of response, it's interesting in Buddhist ethics, right? There's this idea of right speech or proper use of speech. And I think it would be fair to say that in these cases, not speaking about something like that, silencing an allegation that's come forward, and the person behind the allegation that's come forward could be interpreted as a form of harmful speech. It's a lack of correct speech, at least. So yeah, it's very difficult for the survivor, but I would say it's also, I would argue that it's very corrosive for communities too, because it often, I think, ends up being very divisive, when you don't have a kind of process where transparency is able to happen and accountability is able to happen. Inevitably, what you end up having is you have kind of a gossip mill, and you have people falling into camps, right? Some people kind of believing the survivors, some people throwing their loyalty and their trust and their faith behind the teacher. And so it's, it's a division, it's a Sangha Bheda, right? It's a division in the Sangha. And I think that is a very typical thing that happens. One example would be with the Noah Levine case, right? That's a bit more complex case because the investigation was made public and the results were not the report itself, but a summary of the report was made available. But still, people kind of clung to the initial silence around it and the lack of transparency around it. And still to this day, there are people in the Levine case in that community against the stream who deny that it happened, right? And then there are people who are believing the allegations and feeling that they could no longer take Noah Levine as a teacher, who are kind of going to other communities. So I mean, literally the community split in half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was, struck by, people report losing friendships of 20, 30 years. We talk in communities like Shambhala, where you've seen intergenerational abuse. When we've, talked to people, they've reported, like, I was, they were one of my, X was one of my best friends. We grew together for, in the Sangha together for 20, 30 years. And now, we ignore each other. We don't speak at all. And then also it makes people really question their practice. I think a lot of people feel, I've dedicated my life as a Buddhist to cultivating compassion, and then abuse happens, we're not even allowed to talk about it. It really makes them question, like, what is the point of this Buddhist practice? Like, how can we be, spending all this time on the cushion cultivating our compassion through, these specific practices, but when there's, a great harm in the Sangha, that we can't show compassion. So I think, you do find a lot of people leaving Buddhism, actually, as a result, and, again, questioning, the, very, very devoted practitioners questioning, their choices and commitment to the tradition. I'd say that's another form of harm as well.
Can people help bring about changes even though they are just ordinary members of a community?
Yeah, the Healing Our Sangha's website was a response to the allegations against the Karmapa, who's an incredibly important, I don't need to say, incredibly important Tibetan Buddhist teacher, important to Buddhist communities, globally, especially very cherished and important to the Tibetan diaspora and Tibetans themselves. So there were allegations against him. There was an allegation of rape, very serious allegation. He also is said to have fathered a child, and there have been a number of court cases as well. And the Healing Our Sangha's website gives a timeline, and it doesn't actually take a position on the allegations, but it provides a kind of timeline of these events and how they've been covered in the press. And it essentially, its purpose is to to create a space where people who are connected to the Karmapa as students can relate their experiences. So the key point is that the Karmapa actually hasn't publicly responded to the allegations. There's been complete silence. And this has caused a lot of pain among his students. And so this website provides a tool for them, a place for them, a space for them to, just on a basic level, to process their responses to the allegations, and also to feel less alone in them. If you don't have a space to talk openly, and oftentimes, as we've been saying, these conversations are suppressed, they're considered sort of not okay, they're discouraged, right, in people's communities. If you don't have a space to have them, you end up feeling, I think, quite isolated. You're sort of sitting alone with these doubts, as Anne was saying, or a kind of crisis in your practice, and you're doing that completely on your own, which is not healthy and very difficult. So I think at the very least, it provides a kind of sense that there are other people having similar thoughts, and a place to begin to process some of what you're feeling and share thoughts. So I think that's one real function of that site. And if you go on it, you can see a lot of different, kind of witnessing by different people who have different relationships to the Karmapa's communities, and are expressing a lot of different thoughts about it. So that's one thing. And I think the other is that the creators of the site were really hoping it would be a model that could be easily reproduced by other communities, to provide a similar place for sharing of stories and narratives and experiences.
And in what way can that be helpful to people who are survivors of abuse? It seems like I've heard you both interviewed around this website, saying that one of the things that compounded the harm to survivors is the fact that there was no conversation happening around it.
I think it's definitely a benefit. I think just on a basic level, survivors feel someone cares, that they have gone through, this, horrible, event. And I think that's just a very human need, that someone cares that you've been hurt. Someone cares about your suffering. Someone sees your suffering and cares about it. One of the things that's really been, really impactful for Amy and I, doing interviews with survivors, is survivors, that there seems to be something in just telling the story, telling their story to empathetic listeners, that seems to be kind of inherently valuable and kind of healing for survivors. Many survivors that we've interviewed have said, at the end of the interview, or, when we've continued, we continue to stay in touch with them, it really impacted them that we just listened to their story. And so that's really interesting. Like, the power of being heard seems to have a kind of healing, reparative quality to it. I guess that's why, people go to therapy. It does seem to be a human activity, that being really heard does seem to bring about some form of healing. And we're not trained as, therapists ourselves, but you know, it's obvious to us that being heard and being heard empathetically, you know, being attuned to, does reduce, you know, suffering of the survivor. And, you know, just, you know, speaking not as an academic but a Buddhist here in this moment, you know, one of the main reasons that I, you know, started practicing Buddhism coming from a Catholic background was, you know, I want to reduce suffering. You know, the reduction of suffering is at the heart of my practice. So again, I think there's a way that Buddhists who are listening, you know, to this talk can really think about how listening to survivors, you know, I think is an extension of Buddhist practice.
I would love to hear from both of you what you can share with people as guidance or encouragement for how to listen to others when they're speaking about their abuse, because that's a very hard truth to hold.
Yeah, there was something that, that I wanted to, it's related to that question, which is that it's also very difficult it's not necessarily the case that survivors are always ready or they want to really talk about what's happened. You know, it is very difficult. There are issues around trust. It's re-traumatizing to kind of talk about it again and again. And also, I mean, I would also add that survivor stories are generally, when they're made public, do not land in an empathetic space. I mean, typically they land in a pretty hostile space, you know. And so one of the, you know, very obvious patterns we see is that there's oftentimes more compassion for the abuser than there is for the survivor. And there's a, you know, a really important feminist philosopher called Kate Mann, who has sort of theorized that not in a Buddhist context, but in a broader context. And she uses this word himpathy, right? And that it's structural, where, you know, there's sort of all kinds of social, political structures which encourage us to align with power, right? And to have more empathy for the abuser than the survivor. So, I mean, it's not easy for survivors to come out, especially in any kind of public setting, right, and tell these stories. I think one of the reasons that some have done it, like Lama Willa Baker and another person is Rebecca Jameson, is the feeling that if they don't tell their story, someone is going to tell it for them, and they're not going to tell it in a truthful way or in a fair way. So I just wanted to kind of add that in, that it's, you know, not always. It's not a simple thing, right? It's not a, there's certain situations, I think, where it's very important for survivors to tell their story, but it's, you know, there's a lot of risks involved as well in doing that. And to your question about sort of how to do it, I think Anne and I actually we consulted on this before, on that particular point before we came on today, because I think we both really feel, you know, we are not trained. We're not trauma-informed therapists. We're not trained in that way. So, you know, just to say that and name that, we're trained as academics. But I think that when we have spoken to survivors, our rules have been essentially don't interrogate, don't examine, they lead, right? They lead both in the sense of coming to us. We don't ask survivors for interviews. We only kind of talk to survivors when they come to us. And then once we are together, right, talking, having them sort of set the pace and set the content and set the questions, and they're the ones who lead the discussion. And we are there to listen and to, you know, affirm. So anything to add, Anne?
Yeah, you know, listen and affirm, you know. I think, you know, if we notice that, you know, a survivor is, you know, getting emotional, you know, we always say, you know, do you want to take a pause? You know, do you want to take a break? You know, so again, it's just really making sure that that you're receiving, you're not directing or, you know, nitpicking or asking, can you, you know, go over that detail again. So I think just a receptivity and yeah, just a receptivity and an empathetic kind of open-heartedness. And I think, you know, it does actually come naturally, because when you see someone in distress, you know, I find, you know, there is a movement to, you know, to kind of be with them in that moment. So for us as well, we're academics, we're not therapists, but as academics, you can also be, you know, not sometimes a bit kind of stiff and formal. And I think that this project's kind of really, you know, pushed us to be really human and relational, you know, with the interlocutors, with the people that we're working with.
Can I add something? I also think in terms of what community members can do and sort of, you know, how to create a space which is affirming and which is safe for survivors. You know, I would also say just also become more educated about the broader issues involved, right? So this is not a uniquely Buddhist phenomenon. This is a broad phenomenon in our society. It takes a particular shape in Buddhist context, but you know, read about consent, read about sexual assault. What is it exactly? And abuse, right? What does it look like? And, you know, there's some really amazing stuff, I think, that's coming out recently. She Said, which is the book about the Weinstein investigations by 2 journalists, is an amazing introduction to kind of legal structures around abuse. Anita Hill's book, you know, it's called Believing, is also a really good it's not a Buddhist, these are, you know, not talking about Buddhist context or Buddhist ethics, but they kind of give, you know, this broader context. And this is the context in which, at least in North America, abuse is happening. It's following many of the same patterns. It's dealing with the same legal system. And then also, you know, read survivor narratives. So the Chanel Miller's book, which is called Know My Name. And she's the, I don't know that if people watching this would know about the Stanford rape case, which happened, I think it was 2015. But it was a quite well covered rape case, or assault case. And for a long time, the survivor, the victim in that was Emily Doe. She was anonymous, but she wrote a book that came out, I think, last year, called Know My Name, in which she kind of comes out as herself and tells her story. And it's completely eye-opening about what is the experience of being a survivor. So I would say also just we could learn a lot ourselves about it, and that will help us if we do, you know, have this happen in our communities, how to respond.
As a systemic issue, that means there are conditions that are present in all different sorts of Buddhist communities. What can we who are part of Buddhist communities look out for? What kinds of relationships, what kind of ideologies, what kind of practices might we want to be taking a hard look at to make our spaces safer for people?
I mean, I would say, you know, unquestioning devotion to any leader is going to be increasing, you know, its risk of abuse if situations or abuse not being responded to appropriately. I think, you know, also isolated communities that are insular, you know, and that, you know, can manifest in different ways. It can manifest in communities that, you know, discourage, you know, community members from engaging with other Buddhist teachers or lineages, or, you know, systems outside of Buddhism. That kind of, you know, closed system, again, can be, you know, risk can increase risk of abuse, or certainly increase poor response if abuse happens. Gendered hierarchies, if you're in a community where, you know, women are, you know, occupying, like, you know, quite clearly like lower positions and not holding authority, I would, you know, be kind of, you know, questioning the gender hierarchy of the community. Amy, what do you think?
Those were my big three too. I was just sexism and misogyny. How about we start with that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
those are conditions for abuse. And then, yeah, I would just underline what Anne noted about unquestioned loyalty to an authoritative teacher, right? And then, yeah, communities that are isolated or are isolating themselves, especially when these kinds of issues are coming up, right?
As scholars, we know that, that the history of Buddhism is really complex, and that there's, often, different interpretations of key doctrines. Like within the tradition itself, there's actually great multiplicity. And I think that it's really important for practitioners to kind of have some kind of historical consciousness around Buddhism as a religious tradition. I think for Buddhist converts, people who come into Buddhism not as a familiar or cultural religion, often have very romantic ideas of Buddhism. And I think it's really important to bring Buddhism down to earth. This is an historical religion like all other religions. And then also that for them to realize that there are different ways within the tradition itself of interpreting, doctrines, because often doctrines can be presented in one way that kind of prevent kind of questioning. So some opening up around kind of doctrinal, interpretation, innovation, I think is very healthy, because you actually do find the same doctrine, being interpreted in different ways, actually in situations of abuse. And in some ways, the doctrine supports, discussing abuse, kind of having an investigation, getting really clear of what is the truth here and who was actually harmed. And in other ways, the doctrine is used, to squelch any discussion, and actually causes further harm. So history and multiplicity of, Buddhism, I think, super important as well.
I love that. Yeah. And, having an open environment where inquiry and critical thinking is encouraged.
Yeah.
Where people do have questions around, for instance, sexual ethics, there's a place to have those conversations. Yeah, and I think one last thing, which actually I've heard Anne say this many times, which is on some level holding the Dharma lightly, right? And understanding that a teacher may be the most amazing meditation teacher and may be teaching, a certain doctrine in a way that just blows your mind, right? That doesn't mean that same person is expert in all areas of life. And being able to get your head around that, right, as a student, I think again is really healthy and important.
Yeah, we're also really inspired that, your community is interested in this topic. That's something that's going to end abuse when communities start to engage this topic.
Absolutely.
So we're kind of we're part of this movement. Hopefully, all of us, the three of us who are speaking now, and everyone who's listening, of moving towards ending abuse. In Buddhist communities and responding better, ending the suffering of abuse, multiple layers of it, of suffering, of abuse.
Doing the work
together.
I'm so grateful to both of you for dedicating your academic work to this and also putting so much of yourselves and your heart into it. I know a lot of people are being healed and protected, and a lot of good will come from it.
We definitely hope our work can be of benefit to, as many sentient beings, as we say in Buddhism, as possible.
And thank you for the invitation. And we were really honored to be able to have this conversation with you and share it with your community.